Serra is one of the most powerful planeswalkers that Magic the Gathering has ever seen, but ultimately, love spelled her downfall. Greetings, owners of fine luxury cardboard rectangles. The time has come. The time to talk about Serra. Some of you may know, some of you may not know, that in Modern Horizons, we will be getting the Serra card. It has been spoiled, we have seen it. So we'll take a look at the card at the end of the loregasm that we're gonna have here. It's because Serras Story is fantastic. Honestly, this is something I should have probably covered beforehand, but considering how many different stories there are to tell, I kind of put it on the back burner. It's pretty epic, but with the card coming out, I finally decided, you know what, we've got to delve in to the tragic tale of Serra, the goddess planeswalker. So, Serra's been around in terms of Magic since all the way back in the beginning of the game. The first card that we ever see talking about Serra is the Serra Angel. A lot of people know this one. The most current incarnation of it has been printed in Dominaria. Serra was a goddess who created angels to worship and serve her. She does actually have an interesting kind of parallel to gods that we have in our real world with the whole veneration thing. This is an old school planeswalker. I mean, we're looking at the beginning of Magic when planeswalkers were considered something different. So let me go over that so you have a firm understanding of what we're dealing with. Because the planeswalkers from the current age are not on the same strength level. Before the time rifts changed how planeswalkers worked, and it was really just a functional change, so Wizards of the Coast could justify printing planeswalker cards. But story-wise, what happened was the power of all planeswalkers was diminished. Before this change occurred, planeswalkers were essentially the power level of gods, or maybe even more powerful, because gods are kind of tied to one world, whereas planeswalkers can traverse different worlds, and Serra was actually worshipped on multiple planes of existence. So, in a way, Serra is stronger than a regular god. Now, the whole thing that happened here with her, basically, you start out with a situation where you learn about her being part of the religion, specifically on the world of Dominaria. There is a temple in Epitir, and you can actually see it represented in the real world card Clifftop Retreat. You can see the temple there, and it's beautiful, honestly. It's a really gorgeous piece of artwork where you've got a gigantic stone Serra with her wings coming up out of the mountains. It's half mountain and half her wings have been carved into it. Well, this is basically where the worship of Serra started on Dominaria, with the precursor to the Benalish Empire. So before Benalia, there was Sheolton. And Sheolton is where Serra's belief kind of grew. But at first, it wasn't really accepted. There was a different church that people worshipped at, the Angel Fire. Basically, the Angel Fire Church, which was veneration of Gabriel Angel Fire, that tiny little child angel that we saw originally from Legends. It's actually not that great a card-wise, but it's very interesting to note that there was actually a religion based around venerating him. They had churches with crazy little candles that would glow with like green and reddish flames. So originally, they were trying to stamp out the belief in Serra. Believing in Serra wasn't really publicly accepted. It was the lesser known religion, lesser accepted. What happened at a certain point is a priest who was tired of Sheolton's rule over their part of the world basically summoned Serra Angels, and these Serra Angels helped to overthrow the Sheolton Empire in that area. And that actually led to the tipping point of the change of the leadership and everything going on in that part of the world. And actually, that's what ushered in the Benalish Empire. So basically, Serra helped establish Benalia back in the day, not through intentionally intervening herself, but by allowing her angels to come and answer the prayers of these priests. So Serra traveled a bunch of different places. The first place that the Serra Angels showed up, the first place that she created her first angels was in Dominaria, but that wasn't her prime home. She actually was so powerful that she created her own plane of existence made out of purely white mana. Now, you may know from sets like Conflux, or not Conflux, I should say, but Shards of Alara, where the world is broken into different shards. Worlds can't properly exist without all 5 colors of mana in their natural state. If you find a naturally existing plane of existence, it will have all 5 colors of mana in it. To have the sort of plane she did composed entirely of white mana, it's what's known as an artificial plane, and it was constructed purely through her will and massive amounts of white mana. Now, this realm was filled predominantly with angels, but Serra did also import human beings. She brought human beings from different places like Dominaria, her worshippers from different places, because she wasn't just worshipped on Dominaria. Actually, the Aven have the ancestor, as it's known. The nomads and the Avens worshipped someone known as the ancestor, and that is also Serra. Basically, they worshipped a sky goddess who actually turned out to be Serra. So she brought believers from different places to come and live in her realm. And in her realm, it's all these gigantic floating platforms, basically like little floating islands, and they all have plant life and everything going on there, and they're all constantly in motion. But through her divine will, none of these little like islets would end up crashing into each other. They all kind of moved on a giant kind of clockwork schedule. Obviously, it's not clockwork because it's controlled by a goddess. But that was the concept, is these islands would all be shifting around and flying. And that's actually when they went back to Dominaria. If you see the churches up in the air and everything like that, that is Serras Influence. And she lived in her main fortress, Serras Cathedral there, essentially. And basically, she had these lenses set up in there that she could view the entire plane through. Like, it's too much for any kind of mortal to be able to view through, but it was set up in a way where she could view the entirety. Sorry, Sanctum of Serra, my apologies, not Serra Cathedral, that's a different building. Sorry, the Sanctum of Serra is where she resided with all of these crazy ways of keeping track of everybody. And she also, that's where the humans would go and live when they were children. All of the children were brought to live in the Sanctum of Serra, where she would actually personally teach them. While she was a goddess and she was worshipped, she wasn't like an egomaniac that demanded worship. She accepted the worship of people, and she strove to lead them effectively. If you look at the card Worship, you can see her standing there in front of a statue of herself, and it's saying, believe in the ideal, not the idol. So instead of worshiping her, what she wants you to worship is what she believes in. And this would all be taught to people through the Song of Canto, which has like 1,000 some odd different verses. And we would see these different verses put on different angel cards, like Angel of Grace and things like that. You would get snippets of the Song of All. Now, the Song of All doesn't exist anywhere specifically. So she's on this plane of existence that she's created herself with just white mana. She views over the whole plane, keeping track of everything, keeping everybody safe. She has all these different human settlements that live on these different floating islands. They all bring their children to be reared by a goddess. How could you not worship her in this regard? Think about this. She's incredibly benevolent, right? I mean, she's called Serra the Benevolent, and she is. She very much cares about the angels and the humans that live in her realm and on other planes of existence, as demonstrated by the fact that she sent the Serra angels to help the priest overthrow this empire that was basically being tyrannical and holding them down. So she lived in this plane of her own construction for thousands of years. But at a certain point, Urza makes his way to the realm of Serra. What happened was Urza was heavily injured in his war with the Phyrexians, and he and Xantia needed a place to spend their downtime to heal. So Urza actually spent 5 years recovering in Serra's plane and learning from it. Until that point, Urza didn't really understand that planes created of one mana, like these artificial planes. He didn't realize these were a thing. And actually, by studying Serra's realm, he learned more about what he would need to know to defeat the Phyrexians, because Phyrexia is also an artificial plane constructed entirely of black mana. So, unfortunately for Urza, and more unfortunately for Serra actually, the Phyrexians were able to track him to Serra's realm. They had never been able to access this place before, but they were able to find it due to Urza and Xantcha. So after Urza ended up healing up, after the 5-year idyllic span of him just spending time in this pure place of white mana and comfort, the Phyrexians end up attacking, and they end up wiping out a bunch of Serra's subjects. The combination of the Phyrexians being there and Xantcha being there, the Phyrexians mainly, what happens is their black mana ends up tainting Serra's world. So there's like a black essence that's basically infused now due to the mayhem and the leftover bodies of the Phyrexian, all that. It infuses a black essence into the plane. Now Serra couldn't handle this. She could no longer dwell in her perfect realm. So she gathered up a number of her subjects and left. She decided to leave the plane, and she left it in the care of Radiant. Now, we will talk about Radiant Archangel and what happened with her plane at another time, because it gets crazy. Basically, Radiant tries to govern the plane in Serra's absence, but there's a number of issues. She can't actually use the many lens sphere setup to view over the plane and rule over it. Also, she's not a goddess, so she doesn't have the same level of power. She was paranoid, so she actually ended up becoming an unwitting tool of the Phyrexians and kind of a terror of the plane of existence that Serra actually had to deal with later on. Serra comes back later and humbles her. And it's a really interesting story, the whole downfall of Radiant, but we're focused on Serra's story here. So suffice it to say, she left her plane in the hands of who was supposed to be a capable caretaker, but unfortunately, that turned out to not be the case. So, bereft, Serra wandered through the blind eternities, visiting different planes of existence, trying to find a new home, right? And she ends up in Olgrotha, where she actually falls in love with another planeswalker, a planeswalker known as Pharos, all right? So, she falls in love with Pharos. They live together on Olgrotha for a fair amount of time, protected from the rest of the multiverse. Essentially what happened was, Pharos had something called Pharos' ban, where he knew that Olgrotha was a very special plane, and it hadn't really had much in the way of planeswalker interference, and he wanted to keep it that way. What happened was Taysir, who's a really powerful planeswalker, ended up chasing another planeswalker back to Olgrotha and just unmade him. And this basically set Pharos off to the point where he's like, okay, I've got to protect Olgrotha. We're going to create Pharos' ban, which encapsulated Olgrotha in its own little protective cocoon that planeswalkers couldn't pierce their way into, right? And this also helped to protect the people of Olgrotha from Baron Senger and his vampires, that kind of nature. But at a certain point, and maybe we'll give Pharos his own video as well, because it's an interesting story, but Pharos ends up accidentally dying, actually as a result of Pharos' ban. It's tied into the magic of Pharos' ban. So he's tinkering around, unwanted things happen, and poof, Pharos is gone. Now, Serra's lost her husband. She's gone, right? So she's just completely heartbroken and destroyed. She can't stand to stay on Olgrotha anymore. She's like, I can't be here. I can't be here. It reminds me of him. So she leaves. She heads back to Dominaria, to Circe specifically, which, if you don't know, is a part of Dominaria which is famous for its Pegasi. The Pegasus will come and choose maidens maidens who are pure, to bear them aloft on the wings of the Pegasi. So she goes and hangs out in Circe, kind of like just blending in with refugees. She doesn't want to be dealing with the worship of the people. She's not looking to have her angels around her. She's just looking to kind of escape, numb her mind, just get away from all of it. So basically what happens is another planeswalker shows up in Circe and mistakenly and tragically sees Serra's wedding ring, sees that and thinks it's an artifact of great power because of how much it means to her. But it's just a regular wedding ring. There's no special properties to it or whatever. So he basically attacks her to try and get this wedding ring. And she ends up getting just brutalized by this. Now, at this point, you have to understand, remember, these planeswalkers are all gods. Serra could have healed herself from the wounds inflicted by this thieving planeswalker, but she didn't have the heart to do it anymore. She was so broken by the loss of Pharos that she couldn't bring herself to actually go ahead and heal herself up. She allowed herself to fade away. And what she did as her last act, because being Serra the Benevolent, even at her end, when she no longer wanted to exist, she used the last of her power to sanctify the land around Cersei, all right? And then basically Brother Angus comes and finds Serra's body, and he goes along and he builds a cathedral of Serra, basically takes her, entombs her, and builds the cathedral of Serra around her. And this cathedral of Serra, every once in a while, Serra angels will just poof, mystically appear there. So even though she's gone, her essence lingers on. It's infused in the lands of Cersei, specifically in the Cathedral of Serra. You have Serra angels popping into existence, which is really neat. She's an interesting, tragic character with obviously from the time of true power of planeswalkers. Now, when we take a look at her cards specifically, I really like this card. It depicts her, like the only other time we really see Serra, honestly, is when you look at like artwork like Congregate or Worship. We already looked at Worship. If you look at Congregate, you can see her standing out on the balcony. This looks to me like it would be part of the Serra's Sanctum. Now, you can see her standing there while all these angels are flying up to her. And actually, the flavor text references the Song of All. It's Canto 642. I think there are 1,008 cantos in the Song of All. So this one says, in the gathering, there is strength for all who found her, renewal for all who languish, love for all who sing. And you look at what it does. Target player gains 2 life for each creature on the battlefield. So this is Serra either being able to bolster herself or others. Definitely has got the right flavor to it. The card itself, to return to Serra the Benevolent, she looks absolutely fantastic. She's just a beautiful, powerful looking individual. In the back, you can actually see this would be her pictured in her home realm, because you can see one of the floating islands that I mentioned right back up there in the corner. Her abilities reference 3 different cards specifically tied to her. You have Serra Aviary, which ties to her +2 ability. Creatures you control with flying get +1/+1 until end of turn. Now, granted, the Aviary is a permanent bonus as long as the enchantment's out, but that is what it's a nod to. The second ability, the -3, is to create her iconic angels, the 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. It essentially makes a Serra angel. And the -6 ability is you get an emblem with, if you control a creature, damage that will reduce your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. So this is the worship concept. As long as there are people who believe in her, she won't be going anywhere. I do have one kind of minor nitpick. I mean, and that's the whole -3 to create an angel uses up most of her loyalty. But this is that weird threshold where they're using Serra, and Serra died before the change where all planeswalkers became weaker. So the concept of planeswalkers now is you only get them to use a fraction of their ability with you. It's kind of like, hey, we're friends, I'll do you a favor. So she'll summon up an angel or 2, but it just, in a way, the card doesn't feel as powerful as it should, truthfully. But I really like the fact that all 3 of the abilities specifically tie into white cards that pre-existent that are already tied to Serra. Overall, for me, it's an absolutely amazing story. It's really sad to think about Serra at the end, where she built a plane, she spent all of her life basically helping others, and then what happens because she's helping others? She loses her home. Her home gets obliterated. Then she goes and finds joy in marriage. And what happens? The man she loved, he gets wiped out. So then, bereft and broken, she leaves and just kind of wanders along as a broken woman until she's attacked by some unscrupulous thief, and she just doesn't have the will anymore to restore herself and lets herself fade away. To me, that is an ultimately tragic story, but definitely very, very interesting. It's the kind of thing that we don't see as much anymore. I'm hoping that War of the Sparks will bring some more of these stakes to the game again, where we'll see some other